Hello, I'm Daniel Shore. In the annals of Watergate, a crucial time for President Nixon were the weeks after his second inaugural in January 1973. During that time, he could probably have saved his presidency by making a clean breast of political espionage and apologizing for it. He chose instead to go the route of cover-up, hush money, and designated scapegoats.
The inauguration celebrated the re-election triumph of Richard Nixon. In the VIP enclosure, the White House Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman, shot a home movie of his colleagues celebrating. But behind the victory smiles, the president was entangled in a criminal conspiracy. The chairman of his campaign committee, John Mitchell, had sent a team to break into the Watergate to bug the Democrats' headquarters. When they were caught red-handed, Nixon had launched a cover-up of their links to him.
We had pretty much maintained our silence through the pre-electoral period, understanding, of course, that if Mr. Nixon were defeated, we'd be going down the tube, too.
Nixon's presidency was now held hostage to the continued silence of Howard Hunt and the other Watergate defendants. After the election, a call from Hunt came through to one of Nixon's closest advisors, Charles Colson. He knew it could only mean trouble.
I taped it in order to protect myself.
How are we doing? Well, about as well as can be expected. How are you? Just about the same.
In fact, I was setting my own, preparing my own noose, because the things he said in that tape were furthering the cover-up.
We're protecting the guys who were really responsible. But now that that's, and of course that's a continuing requirement, but at the same time, this is a two-way street.
Mm-hmm. I told him that loyalty is a two-way street. We'd been loyal to them, they hadn't been loyal to us.
We think that there's a time when some moves should be made, and certainly the cheapest commodity available is money. These lawyers have not been paid.
I was trying to shut him up. He was talking about money, and I knew what was going on. I mean, in my heart of heart, I knew this guy was blackmailing us.
The inaugural behind him, the president was at the Western White House in San Clemente. There he received some alarming news.
The Senate tonight voted 77-0 to establish a select committee to investigate the Watergate bugging case. The committee will be headed by North Carolina Democrat Sam Ervin.
Nixon feared the cover-up could not withstand a Senate investigation. If he didn't act quickly, the Watergate conspirators would be put under oath and grilled before the television cameras.
He put some pressure on both Ehrlichman and me as to, what are you doing to get this thought through, game planned, or whatever you want to call it.
Haldeman and Ehrlichman shut themselves off in a luxury resort with the man who was organizing the cover-up, the president's lawyer, John Dean.
On the second day, we really got down to the bottom line, and that was, and this is the premise of an entire session we'd had, was that all those who had been arrested were going to remain silent. And Ehrlichman finally asked me this question, and I said, there's no way, I don't know if they're going to remain silent.
I mean, they were caught red-handed. The question was whether the White House was involved. And it seemed to me that the line had to be drawn between those defendants and the White House.
And the answer was they were going to have to be paid off.
Envelopes stuffed with cash had been sent to Howard Hunt and his men to keep them quiet during the trial. Now, on the eve of sentencing, Hunt asked for a lot more money.
The problem was that these amounts were insufficient, way, way, way under what the requirements were.
Hunt threatened to expose a different break-in, one that could be traced straight back to John Ehrlichman at the White House. This break-in was directed at Daniel Ellsberg, who'd been put on trial for leaking Vietnam secrets. An operation to search for dirt on Ellsberg had been approved by Ehrlichman. Hunt reckoned that the White House would pay a lot to keep him quiet.
All of us were headed for prison, and that something ought to be done, should be done, and if they didn't, then dire consequences for the administration could result. Just a plain statement of fact, not a threat.
Hunt's message got through to the White House. John Dean realized the cover-up was getting out of hand. He steeled himself for a difficult conversation with the president. Unknown to Dean, their meeting, like all those in the Oval Office, was recorded on Nixon's hidden taping system.
After some idle chit-chat and chatter back and forth, I said something to him that I hoped would get his full attention.
We have a cancer within, close to the presidency, that's growing. It's growing daily. It's compounding. It grows geometrically now. And there's no assurance that won't bust.
And then I began to tell him what that cancer was. And it was the cover-up that was literally going to eat his presidency alive.
Now, the blackmail is continuing. Hunt called one of the lawyers from the re-election committee on last Friday to meet with him over the weekend. The guy came in to me to see me to get a message directly from Hunt to me for the first time. Pardon? Hunt is on bail. Correct. Hunt now is demanding another $72,000 for his own personal expenses, another $50,000 to pay his attorney's fees, $120,000. Wanted by the close of business yesterday.
Within the hour, his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, phoned John Mitchell in New York. Mitchell, now a Wall Street lawyer, would have to raise the money for Hunt's payoff.
Mitchell came down to Washington, and we all met in Bob Haldeman's office. Haldeman had 4 chairs in front of his fireplace. At the very outset of the conversation, Ehrlichman floated just out in the air with the question, has Mr. Hunt's problem been taken care of? And John Mitchell turned to me and said, I don't think that's a problem anymore.
One more envelope stuffed with cash had been sent to Howard Hunt.
Mr. Hunt, was there anyone higher up involved in the conspiracy?
I would testify as follows, gentlemen, that to my personal knowledge there was not.
Hunt was not the only danger. There was also the man who planted the bugs in the Watergate, the security chief of Nixon's re-election campaign, James McCord.
I had told my family that I'd made a mistake in participating in the first place, and I felt the only way to set it straight was to ask my Lord's forgiveness and to tell the truth at the propitious time. Now, my family kept asking me at various times during the next 6 or 8 months, well, is this a propitious time?
That time came, he decided, the day the Watergate defendants were to be sentenced. McCord wrote to the judge, John Sirica. His letter was the first crack in the cover-up.
He picked up this letter and just sort of held it in front of him, and he began to very slowly read. Item 1, there was political pressure applied to the defendants to plead guilty and to remain silent.
The letter went on to say that perjury had occurred during the trial. Then came his most ominous allegation. There were others involved in the Watergate operation who had not been identified.
And then he said, well, court's adjourned. And then he just sat back to see what the effect was on everybody of what he had been reading, and it was absolute pandemonium.
But McCord had not revealed the names of the others he said were involved. The judge indicated that if McCord wanted to get his sentence reduced, he'd have to talk to the Senate Watergate Committee.
Hear from these men. What Judge Sirica has done has made it much more, given us a greater opportunity to get some of the information that might not have been made available by people who, I believe, really have the information.
The Senate hearings were not due to start for another 2 months. Until then, the committee's counsel was determined to keep whatever McCord might tell him from the press. His main concern was the Washington Post, where two reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, had kept Watergate in the headlines, exasperating the White House.
I don't respect the type of journalism, the shabby journalism that is being practiced by the Washington Post.
There was a reporter on a rival newspaper who had an in with McCord. Bob Jackson had known him for years. He got a scoop that shook the White House. What McCord had secretly given the committee was names. This was bad news for John Dean.
This surfaced my ubiquitous participation in the Watergate cover-up. It was inevitable. As soon as they started down any road, they were going to find me there because I'd been everywhere. So the press was just surrounding my house, and it looked like they were going to camp out indefinitely. And the president called, and he said, well, John, why don't you go to Camp David and get away from it all?
Dean readily accepted the chance to escape to the rustic presidential retreat. But Nixon's hospitality had a sting in its tail.
I said that John Dean should make a report. And I said, we have to have a statement.
Dean knew the president needed a scapegoat before the Senate hearing started, and he began to fear he was it.
If I put all that I had done in a report, the president, one, could say, well, this is all I ever knew. This is the first time it was ever revealed to me, and use that as a shield, but also use it as a sword against me. So I started walking in the woods up there, and I got to thinking about, what am I going to do when I have to testify? Well, I pulled my oar as hard as anybody in the cover-up. I thought it unfair that I was being asked, in essence, to take the fall, and it angered me.
By the time John Dean returned to town, he had made up his mind. He would not be the president's scapegoat. But Dean was not the only one to be named by McCord. John Mitchell's deputy, Jeb Magruder, had lied under oath to protect the cover-up. He asked for a meeting to see if he could still rely on his fellow conspirators.
Well, Mitchell's line was that he was going to stick by his story. The line that Dean took was that he was going to tell the truth, whatever that was.
And I listened to Jeb as he was trying to sell me on buying into his story, and I said, Jeb, well, I might have said that, but I didn't say I was going to testify that way. That's a big difference.
The difference, of course, now was that I was the one who had committed perjury, whereas Dean hadn't committed perjury, so I was stuck.
In fact, so was Dean. To avoid perjury when he testified, he would have to confess to his own crimes. And as soon as he could, he sought the advice of a top criminal lawyer.
So I told Dean that the thing I was going to try to do was get him immunity. And that is, he could cooperate, but he wouldn't pay the price of a criminal conviction and sentence. And that appealed to Dean.
To get immunity, they'd have to excite the prosecutors with the evidence that Dean could offer. Schaffer paid a visit to federal prosecutor Seymour Glanzer.
I said to Glanzer that his approach was all out of whack, that he was focusing on a second-rate burglary, that he didn't really have a clue as to what happened in the post-burglary events, that my client had all the clues.
And in return for that, he wants immunity, and he deserves it.
He was going to be the key Watergate witness in their prosecution of some pretty big people.
Dean wouldn't talk about the biggest, the president, because he still worked for him. But to get immunity from prosecution, Dean would have to implicate Nixon's most powerful associates.
I was in San Clemente with the president and about to get on the plane to fly back to Washington when I had a phone call from John Dean, who, it turned out, was calling to tell me that he had now made plans to go to the prosecutors. I was sort of surprised by this because it was out of the blue, and so I said, well, just remember, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, there's not much you can do about it.
Well, the toothpaste went out that afternoon.
The presidential party flew back to Washington as Dean began to tell the prosecutors how the White House had obstructed justice. Nixon and Haldeman didn't know exactly what Dean was revealing, but they feared he might sink the cover-up and the administration with it.
We were going through all kinds of things about how do you get this back on the track where it belongs. I mean, containment had fallen apart.
Back in the Oval Office, Nixon held a crisis meeting. A new scapegoat had to be found. Campaign chairman John Mitchell seemed the logical choice, but he was the president's closest political friend. To persuade Mitchell to fall on his sword, Ehrlichman rehearsed the line someone would have to put to him.
The president strongly feels that the only way that this thing can end up being even a little net plus for the administration is for you to go in and voluntarily make a statement. I am both morally and legally responsible. Yeah.
And then there was a great choosing up of sides as to who was going to do that. And Nixon kept saying, well, it should be somebody who's very familiar with the facts. Well, I didn't get it at first, but what he was doing was pointing at me.
Got it.
So Haldeman called him, and Mitchell arrived at my office. And I said, all trails lead back to you, and the president and I feel strongly that you've got to come forward and protect him. And Mitchell puffed on his pipe and looked at me like I was out of my mind.
There's no question about it. The White House doesn't, as I understand it, have anything to come clean about.
John Mitchell's wife, Martha, was less discreet.
My husband has done everything to protect Mr. President. They have all let him down. They have all gotten away from the good people.
You mean let Mr. Nixon down or let Mr. Mitchell down?
Mr. Mitchell has become the fall guy.
That afternoon, Mitchell's former deputy killed off the idea of a single scapegoat. Jeb Magruder went to the prosecutors and corroborated John Dean's story.
They realized that it wasn't just Jeb and John Dean and Gordon Liddy, it was John Mitchell, it was Bob Haldeman, it was, half the people in the White House and at the committee to re-elect, and maybe even the President of the United States.
We had got to the point where we were just sitting on a keg of dynamite, and we concluded that we had no choice other than to tell Henry Peterson.
Peterson, the man in charge of the Justice Department's prosecutors, briefed the president the next day.
I remember Henry Peterson coming in on that Sunday afternoon. He gave me a piece of paper indicating that they had knowledge of Haldeman's participation and they had knowledge of Ehrlichman's participation.
My position was that I can't guarantee you that we have a criminal case at this point, but I can guarantee you that these people are going to be a massive source of embarrassment to the presidency.
And he said, Mr. President, these men have got to resign. You've got to fire them. And I said to him, but Henry, I can't fire men simply on the basis of charges.
Nixon went sailing on a presidential yacht to consider how to break the news to Haldeman and Ehrlichman. He knew they wouldn't go without a struggle.
My feeling was that there were no grounds for kicking me out.
We really devoted 100% of our time to Watergate. What should we do? Should we resign? Should we take leaves of absence? Somewhere along the line in there, Easter Sunday came along, and the president went to Key Biscayne. First time I hadn't gone with him to Key Biscayne for Easter. It became more and more evident that the chances of our being cleared were getting slimmer and slimmer.
Their fate was sealed when the secret Nixon would have paid $1 million to protect came out. John Dean's lawyer led the prosecutors to the evidence.
Charlie Schaffer said, oh, by the way, there's something further that you might be interested in knowing that my client can tell you. And then he turned to Mr. Dean and said, tell him, John.
I explained to them that they had in their files information that was evidence of a break-in and a burglary of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office.
We had this picture. It showed parking spaces with the names of people on the parking space. It didn't make any sense to us. And we said, what in the world is that all about?
They were photocopies of snapshots that Howard Hunt had taken at the psychiatrist's office. The CIA, which had developed them for Hunt, had passed them on to the prosecutors with no explanation. Dean revealed what they were, evidence that Watergate was just one in a series of White House crimes.
Earl Silber immediately recognized the significance, and his mandible or jaw just dropped open, and he got right quiet.
The next morning, Henry Peterson received a memo from Silbert. He went to the president with the news that 2 White House employees had burglarized a doctor's office.
And the president said, when I told him, I know about that. That's a national security matter. You stay out of that.
Peterson did put the evidence of the Ellsberg break-in before the judge who made it public. Now, Ehrlichman, who had authorized the Ellsberg operation, faced prosecution. The president could hesitate no longer.
I got a call from the president from Camp David, and the White House operator got me on the phone, and there was a long, long delay before finally the president came on in a very muffled, downbeat voice and said, I was wondering if you could get up here at 1:30 today.
Bob Haldeman called me and said, the president wants to see us. I said, what's up? He says he's decided to fire us.
It would take all Nixon's political skills to persuade the 2 men who knew his guilty secrets to sacrifice themselves to save him.
Haldeman came in first. He's standing as he usually does. Not a dramatic Nazi stormtrooper, but just a decent, respected, crew-cut guy. That's the way Haldeman was.
Even while he was being fired, the chief of staff took notes.
The president said, let's go out and look at the tulips. I may not be alive much longer, so I've got to enjoy beauty while I can.
Nixon let Haldeman know that he even intended to resign himself.
I said, you can't resign. You've got to stay as president. And he said, well, Ehrlichman thinks that I should. He was really concerned because he thinks that Ehrlichman wants him to admit that he ordered illegal acts.
Seeing his president so overwrought, the chief of staff loyally agreed to go.
Ehrlichman then came in, and I took Ehrlichman out on the porch at Aspen.
And we stood there. We didn't sit down. He said, I guess Bob's told you why I wanted you to come. I said, yes.
I could just hardly bring myself to tell Ehrlichman that he had to go because I knew he was going to resist it. I said, you know, John, when I went to bed last night, he said, I hoped, I almost prayed I wouldn't wake up this morning.
And he began to sob. And I put my arm around his shoulder. At that point, I was feeling more sorry for him than I was for myself. He was evidencing great distress. And he turned and walked out of the room.
After Ehrlichman left, the president had me come back and to review his meeting with Ehrlichman.
Although the Ehrlichman meeting had gone well, Nixon was concerned that he wouldn't go quietly. He feared that Ehrlichman still wanted the president to admit he had ordered the illegal acts. The next night, the president went on television to announce he had cleaned up his administration.
Today, in one of the most difficult decisions of my presidency, I accepted the resignations of 2 of my closest associates in the White House, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, 2 of the finest public servants it has been my privilege to know. The counsel to the president, John Dean, has also resigned.
Now that Dean was out, he needed immunity more than ever. His lawyer told him it was time to tell the whole story, sparing no one.
I said, so what about the president? We can't talk about the P. I says, the P? I says, what are you talking about, the P? He says, Oh, it's the national security, it's attorney-client privilege, it's this, that's the other thing. I says, if the two of you in the pod committing the crime together, I says, there's no privilege that protects one co-conspirator from another co-conspirator.
Dean finally agreed to tell the prosecutors about his conversations with the president, including the one in which Nixon had said he could get $1 million to pay off the burglars.
It was clear that what he was saying was that the president knew all about what was going on and had been advised and was reported to and was informed of things.
The prosecutors disagreed on whether Dean's new evidence justified immunity. Seymour Glanzer was convinced it was worth giving him a deal in order to prosecute the men above him.
That was a very persuasive argument, and Seymour is very persuasive. I just felt differently.
Silbert felt that if the president's counsel broke the law, he must not go unpunished, and he had the final say.
We told him, Silbert told him unequivocally that there was not going to be immunity for Dean.
I said no deal, and I told Glanzer, I said, Glanzer, you haven't got the only show in town.
The other show in town that could grant Dean immunity was the Senate Watergate Committee. Chairman Sam Ervin and his fellow Democrats were delighted to have Dean as their star witness, but the vice chairman was out to shield the White House from his own committee's investigation.
And it was absolutely natural for the ranking Republican, the senior Republican, to go down to the White House and say, look, I'm your friend, and I'm going to try to keep these heathen devils from biting your ankle.
Baker's loyalties were put to the test even before the public hearings began. At a closed session, the Democrats proposed granting immunity to Dean. Senator Baker bristled.
I especially resented that he really showed no trace of remorse about his lack of fidelity to his former boss.
Baker then said, why should we give immunity to the worst criminal in Watergate? He's the one that ought to be indicted. He's the one that should be imprisoned, John Dean.
But Baker convinced only one other Republican, Senator Gurney, to vote with him. It was time for Baker to steer a center course.
Senator Baker then said to Gurney, well, you know, we do want the public to respect this committee, and it won't look good that if we seem like we're not all together. So I'm willing to change my vote.
The committee voted unanimously to request Judge Sirico to enter orders allowing the committee to give immunity to John W. Dean III.
Dean had struck an excellent deal. He would write a statement describing everything he had done in the cover-up, but the Republicans would be prevented from seeing it in advance.
The deal with Dash was that Dean was to come right out of my office and appear on public session, on television, in the Senate.
John Dean now set out on a course that would destroy the President of the United States.
Subcommittee will come to order.
Dean's appearance was carefully staged. Horn-rimmed glasses instead of his usual contact lenses, and a new short haircut. Dean's testimony described all his meetings with the president in chilling detail.
The meeting with the president that afternoon with Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and myself was a tremendous disappointment to me because it was quite clear that the cover-up, as far as the White House was concerned, was going to continue.
Republicans were absolutely helpless to do anything with Dean's testimony.
Accordingly,
keeping the Republicans away from Dean before he testified paid off. Baker had to digest 245 pages of complex testimony as Dean delivered it.
I said, this is like trying to shovel smoke. You know, there's so many facts, and they go in so many different directions. I don't have the foggiest idea, really, what our objective is. What are we after? I want to try to focus this inquiry.
I'm trying to focus on the president. What did the president know, and when did he know it?
Baker's question was subtlety itself. He sounded as though he was being tough on the president, but he was actually being tough on Dean.
Can you tell us whether or not you can shed any further light on whether the president knew of the break-in of the Watergate complex on June 17th?
You mean, did he have prior knowledge of it?
Yes.
I cannot testify of any first-hand knowledge of that.
But Dean's knowledge of the president's role in the cover-up was first-hand.
He asked me how much it was going to cost. I gave him my best estimate, which I said was $1 million or more. He, in turn, said to me that, well, $1 million is certainly no problem to raise.
The Republicans had run out of ideas.
Before you do, let me reiterate. The focus of my inquiry is on what did the president know.
And there are two questions to which we must address ourselves here. What did the president know, and when did he stop knowing it?
Several high-ranking members of the Democratic Party are attempting to seize control of the government of the United States by legitimate means.
A new danger to the presidency was public ridicule, as television, sitcoms, and soaps were replaced by the Senate hearings.
Since you were the Attorney General of the United States, why didn't you throw Mr. Liddy out of your office?
Well, I think Mr. Dash, in hindsight, I know I should have thrown him out of the office. I should have thrown him out of the window.
Well, since you did neither,
and that relates to some of the subject matter that I'm, at this point, not able to talk to the committee about.
The foreign intelligence activities had nothing to do with the opinion of Ellsberg's psychiatrist about his intellectual, emotional, or psychological state.
How do you know that, Mr. Chairman?
Because I can understand the English language. It's my mother tongue.
We're Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and Dean. Our job was to see that the White House stayed green. We might have had flaws like bending the laws, but God only knows it was for a good cause. But so it won't come as a terrible blow. There's one little thing that we think you should know. Whatever we say isn't quite what we mean. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and Dean.
Nixon's men weighed in to defend him. At first, Haldeman seemed to confirm Dean's most damaging testimony.
And Dean said probably $1 million. But the problem is that it is hard to raise. The president said there is no problem in raising $1 million.
But he added a sentence that reversed the meaning.
We can do that, but it would be wrong.
I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in.
I neither took part in nor knew about any of the subsequent cover-up activities. My statement has
Been challenged by only one of the 35 witnesses who appeared.
Dean was saying one thing, and the White House was saying something contradictory, and Senator Ervin felt like there may never be a way that this was going to be resolved.
But there was a way to resolve it, stemming from a Nixon practice that John Dean had long suspected.
As well. The president almost from the outset began asking me a number of leading questions, which made me think that the conversation was being taped and a record was being made to protect himself.
In fact, all the president's White House meetings were automatically recorded on a secret system that Nixon had installed. One of the few people who knew of its existence was White House aide Alexander Butterfield. When it was his turn to face the committee's investigators, he was not sure he could keep the taping secret without committing perjury.
I had rehearsed this in my mind many, many times. If asked a relatively vague or indirect question, the answer to which would be about the tapes, I could easily fuzz it. I could give a vague answer in response. But if I were asked a direct question, I would give a direct answer, and the tapes would be revealed.
The Democrats' investigator had a document prepared by the president intended to disprove Dean's testimony.
A memo had come over secretly from the White House to the Republicans. It was a detailed account, line by line, quotes of what Dean had said to the president, what the president had said back.
He flipped this little paper my way and said, "Where might this paper have come from?"
And Butterfield picked up the thing and read it and said, oh, this is very detailed, this is very detailed. So, well, where could it come from? He said, well, let me think about that a minute, and he set it down.
And to my great relief, they moved on to other things.
While Scott Armstrong was asking Butterfield about other matters through the remainder of his interview, I was trying to decide how I wanted to approach this because I knew my time would come.
After 3 hours, the Republican counsel got his turn.
I asked Butterfield if there might be any validity to the suggestion made by John Dean in his testimony that there was a taping system in the White House. That
was a direct question. So I said, I remember saying, I don't know why I said this, I said, I'm sorry you fellows asked me that question. Well, I was sorry in a way. Yes, there was. And they said, could you tell us about it?
The Democrats' investigator could hardly wait to tell his boss.
And he came up, his face was drenched, his eyes were bulging, and the first words that came out of his mouth is, the president bugged himself.
But next morning, Saturday, euphoria gave way to doubt.
It could just as likely, if there was a taping system, exonerate the president and prove that John Dean was a liar. I wanted to test Dean's credibility.
The chief counsel met his deputy, and they set off to see Dean.
Sam Dash and Jim Hamilton came out to the house. Mo and I were there, but Sam really got right down to business. And what he told me is he said that, John, there's a taping system in the White House. How do you feel about that?
And I can remember that Mo and John, I believe, was sitting on a couch, and I was standing by the fireplace. And I did that on purpose, so I could gauge John's reaction. I was watching him very intently, and Sam told him, and I never will forget it, John broke into this huge smile, this beaming smile.
I couldn't have been more elated. I said, Sam, I said, everything I've told you, you're now going to find a record for.
Just as a reminder that a day by itself...
On Monday morning, Butterfield was having his hair cut. Over the weekend, surprisingly, the news had not leaked and the committee had not summoned him. He thought he'd been spared the ordeal of testifying in public after all.
And suddenly there's a phone call, so they bring the phone over to me, and I answered, it's Jim Hamilton.
And I said to him that the committee wanted him to testify that afternoon. And he was quite upset about this.
I was profane, as a matter of fact, and I told Jim Hamilton, nothing against Jim Hamilton, but I just said, I am not going to be there.
So I went back up to the hearing room, and I leaned over to Senator Irvin, and I said, Senator, I have located Mr. Butterfield. He is in the barbershop, but he says he's not going to come.
And I'm watching the TV. All barbershops and beauty salons had the TV on. Suddenly I see Jim Hamilton behind the chairman, and he turns and sort of looks, and Hamilton whispered in his ear something, and those big bushy eyebrows of his, I saw him go, like in disbelief at what he's hearing from Hamilton. Whoop, whoop, whoop.
And he said, you tell Mr. Butterfield that if he is not here early this afternoon, that I'm going to send the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms to arrest him.
I knew he wasn't really going to have federal marshal pick me up on the street, but that was his way of saying, be here.
At shortly after 1, he arrived at the Senate somewhat contrite, more compliant, and nicely coiffed.
Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
Butterfield's revelations came while Nixon was in Bethesda Naval Hospital with pneumonia. His tapes, the evidence that proved his involvement in Watergate, were certain to be subpoenaed. Now he was faced with a crucial decision. Should he destroy them? The president's 2 lawyers, Leonard Garment and Fred Bozart, came to the hospital with his new chief of staff.
The president was in his gown, and we sat down at a table on the other side of the room, across from his bed.
my presentation was centered around the consideration that the destruction of the tapes would be a felony, an obstruction of justice, and could form the first count of a bill of impeachment. And that was something to think about.
On the other hand, bizarre legal point of view was that until they were subpoenaed, these tapes were the president's property. I happen to share that view. The president became very angry and said to me that he was not going to take either of their advice and would prefer to sleep on it overnight. I told him he didn't have long to make his decision.
As Nixon deliberated, his closest advisors urged him to act.
I had a personal phone call from John Connally saying, Bob, you've got to get to the president. You've got to tell him to pile those tapes up in a large pile out in the Rose Garden, assemble the entire press corps around the edges of the Rose Garden, soak those tapes with gasoline and light them with a match.
The people that were getting in touch with him were, for the most part, persons who had had very extensive discussions with him and were on tape and had understandable reasons why they would want those tapes to disappear from the face of the earth.
I considered it, but I felt that it would be an indication that I felt that there were conversations on there that demonstrated that I was guilty. I thought it would be an admission of guilt to destroy them. If I had thought that on those tapes that there was conversation that was criminal, I sure as the dickens would have destroyed them.
3 days after leaving the hospital, the president received a subpoena to hand over the tapes, and Nixon's refusal to surrender them would lead to the fiercest battle of his presidency.
The committee will come to order, and counsel will call the first witness.
Mr. John W. Dean III.
Stand up and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the evidence that you shall give to the Senate...
Only John Dean had testified that the president was criminally involved in the Watergate cover-up.
The meeting with the president that afternoon with Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and myself was a tremendous disappointment to me because it was quite clear that the cover-up, as far as the White House was concerned, was going to continue.
Dean's version of a series of meetings with Nixon was denied by the White House. Cox needed proof. Then the most improbable and complete proof came to light.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
When were those?
The revelation that the president had all his meetings automatically recorded meant that the tapes must contain the answer to the key question. Was the president directly involved in the cover-up? But he refused to surrender the tapes to the special prosecutor.
It therefore becomes my duty promptly to seek subpoenas and other available legal procedures for obtaining the evidence for the grand jury. We will initiate such...
On behalf of the grand jury investigation of Watergate, Cox had a subpoena served on the President of the United States, ordering him to produce 9 specific White House tapes.
One day, Mr. Cox came to us in the jury room and said to us that Mr. Nixon wasn't going to honor the subpoena, and what do we want to do about it.
Notching up the pressure, Cox got the grand jury to vote an order enforcing the subpoena. But the judge told Cox that this unprecedented case called for a breach of the rule of grand jury secrecy.
My jaw figuratively dropped when he said to me, well, Mr. Cox, I don't really doubt your word, but I think I shouldn't simply accept what you say about the grand jury's vote. I ought to have them in open court and poll them. It was a marvelously symbolic scene. There were the 19, 20 grand jurors lined up. They'd be the first 20 people you met on the street. Some black, some white, some employed, others without jobs, old, so forth.
We were really adamant in our position that we had a right as the grand jury people to hear what was on the tapes, and they were really in what we thought were in the public domain. We thought they weren't President Nixon's tapes. We thought they were the public's tapes.
The court, after hearing the presentation, signed the order to show cause. It is returnable August 7 at 10 a.m.
Nixon's lawyers argue that the president's work and that of his successors would be in jeopardy if judges ran roughshod over the confidentiality of presidential meetings. His principles happily coincided with self-interest. The tapes that Cox had subpoenaed were the ones in which the president and his aides plotted the cover-up. One of the most damning was a discussion with John Dean about paying hush money to the Watergate burglars.
It will compound the obstruction of justice situation. People around here are not pros at this sort of thing. This sort of thing mafia people can do.
Each day, a president of the United States is required to make difficult decisions on grave issues.
It will cost money. Very much money. I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next few years. Well, I think that we're you can get $1 million and you can get it in cash. I know where it can be gotten. I mean, it's not easy. But
This kind of frank discussion is only possible when those who take part in it know that what they say is in strictest confidence.
That argument really doesn't prevail. A president, we don't think, would be held by a court to have the right to have secret criminal conversations.
It was not only in pursuit of the tapes that Cox took on the president. His sweeping mandate required him to investigate all presidential abuses. Even the purchase of Nixon's California home at San Clemente was open to Cox's scrutiny. Nixon was outraged.
The president really had concluded as he watched Cox go about his duties that this was a battle to the death, I think, and he said in my hearing, I'm going to get rid of this man.
Before he could act, another scandal hit the White House. Spiro Agnew, the vice president, was under investigation for taking bribes as governor of Maryland. When the attorney general concluded that there was a case, he briefed the president on the details.
I thought the president would be deeply shaken, but his first reaction was, oh God, well, that doesn't surprise me. All the Maryland politicians are like that.
Nixon asked the head of the Justice Department's criminal division, Henry Peterson, to double-check the evidence. Peterson and Richardson reported back the case was solid. They had testimony that Agnew had continued taking bribes even in the White House. One of the many contractors who testified said that when he went to the vice president's office, he handed him an envelope containing approximately $10,000 in cash.
Peterson, not in anger, but in sorrow, said that it was his professional judgment that the charges first were serious. He went on to say, and Richardson strongly said this too, that they would have to recommend a prison sentence for Agnew.
With the right-wing Agnew as his running mate, Nixon had won 2 elections. Now the president could do nothing to help Agnew.
Even if they were framing Agnew, there wasn't any question after hearing Peterson and his version that he was frankly going to get it.
Nixon sent his chief of staff to tell the vice president he must resign. But the man from Baltimore wouldn't go quietly.
In the process of pressuring the vice president, it became very clear that he saw me as part of the problem, and I jokingly said to my wife one night, I said, if I suddenly don't show up tomorrow night for dinner, you better look into the most recently constructed bridge pilings on the Baltimore Bay Bridge.
Because of Watergate, a presidential resignation no longer seemed inconceivable. In that event, this vice president would automatically succeed him. That, to Justice Department insiders, was a nightmare scenario.
Well, the fear I think we all had was that if we went forward with a prosecution, that we'd have the vice president of the United States sitting on the witness stand, raising his right hand, swearing to tell the truth when the doors of the courtroom would burst open and in would come somebody saying the President of the United States has just resigned. You've got your hand up all right, but we want you to take the oath of office.
The prosecutors didn't really have a choice. The vice president had to be brought to justice. But when Richardson and his constitutional expert, the Solicitor General, decided to have Agnew indicted, the president's staff tried to stop them.
It went on for about an hour and a half. Neither side gave way at all. And Haig said, all right, let's go see the president. Well, at that point, Richardson and I said we have to stop in the men's room. We didn't have to, but we wanted to talk. And we went in. By that time, the issue of tapes and so forth was so sensitive. We went in and turned all the water taps on so we could talk without being overheard. I don't think it was tape, it was bugged, but everybody was paranoid by that time. And Elliott said, we have to resign if we can't indict Agnew, don't we? I said, yes, we do.
And Bork said a vice president could be tried on charges by the regular courts.
Agnew was trying to escape a court trial. He claimed the constitutional process was for a vice president to be impeached before Congress.
My view was less technical. I was concerned about having two impeachment have the idea of impeachment in the air, as of an actual impeachment proceeding going on, that it would liable to be contagious.
Nixon saw the point. He chose the lesser of two evils and let Agnew's prosecution go ahead. But the vice president had one more trick up his sleeve. He turned a public appearance in California into a demonstration of support among the party faithful.
You're very kind, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate the warmth of your greeting. I want to say at this point, clearly and unequivocally, I am innocent of the charges against me. I will not resign if indicted. I will not resign if indicted.
That was Agnew's last stand. Outside his hard-right constituency, he had no backing. And so secretly he offered both to resign and to plead guilty to a lesser charge, provided that he not be sent to prison. The Attorney General gathered his team to consider Agnew's proposal. To the prosecutors who had built the case, the whole idea was an affront to the principle of equal justice.
You don't give this guy a significantly better deal than you'd give anybody else who had done that just because he's blackmailing the Department of Justice by, in effect, saying, if you don't give me the deal I want, I'm going to stay in the vice presidency and maybe become president.
But Henry Peterson, the most senior civil servant in the room, saw a different problem.
I had just made some presentation, the importance of treating this guy equally, which meant very harshly. And Peterson paced up and down, and he had his hands thrust in his belt, which was his way, and he literally yelled, "The man is the goddamn vice president of the United States, Barney. What do you want to do, make him crawl on his belly?"
Richardson yielded. He guaranteed that Agnew would not go to jail. In return, the vice president promised to resign. He left for the Baltimore courthouse as vice president, and then his letter of resignation was delivered, and so he appeared before the judge as a private citizen. He pleaded no contest to tax evasion and was fined.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Vice President, thank you.
In Agnew, the law had hit a mighty target. The president set about trying to make certain that he would not be next.
Stand back.
As we were walking to the door, the president said something like, well, now that that has been dealt with, we can go ahead and get rid of Cox.
I mean, it was head-to-head warfare. It was a struggle for Richard Nixon's presidency. And he approached his attitude towards Cox was on that basis, not a matter of some disagreement over a legal issue, but it was life and death of his presidency.
Cox's demand for the White House tapes was moving to a climax in the courts. He had won the opening rounds, but the president's lawyers doggedly appealed to a higher court.
I'd like to be successful in some case, somewhere, sometime. So far, I haven't won a thing.
On the day he chose his new vice president, Nixon lost again. The U.S. Court of Appeals ruled against him 5-2. The judges said he could appeal to the Supreme Court to overturn all previous decisions in the case, an unlikely outcome, or he had to give up the tapes. They gave the president just 1 week to make up his mind, until midnight the following Friday.
We saw a very, very serious problem in that the president was not going to give up the tapes. He was determined not to.
What are you going to do if a president disobeys the order? You know, that was a terribly worrisome thing.
The confrontation could not have come at a worse time. The Arab states had just launched a massive attack on Israel. As the United States and the Soviet Union mounted airlifts to their respective allies, superpower tensions escalated towards a nuclear crisis.
This unhappy concurrence of Nixon going nose-to-nose with his two great enemies in the world, Leonid Brezhnev and Archibald Cox, had the makings of grand tragedy in it.
Against the Russians, the president could act directly, but he couldn't act alone to fire Cox. He had given away that power to the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson.
You know, it was very clear that following Agnew's resignation that the president was then determined to get rid of Mr. Cox and the whole special prosecutor apparatus as it had been set up.
And I said to Al, if you do that, you leave me no choice but to resign. And he said, well, there may be some other way of dealing with the problem.
The other way, which Haig persuaded Richardson to support, was a plan to satisfy the court and keep Cox's hands off the tapes. The White House would pick just one person to listen to the tapes. This ruse was dreamed up by one of Nixon's lawyers, Fred Bozart.
Fred Bozart came into my office with a gleam of hope in his eyes, which was not normally there, and said, Al, we have a solution that I think we may be able to cobble together, which would involve the turnover of the tapes to John Stennis of the Senate.
The senator, a 72-year-old Southern conservative, was a loyal Nixon supporter.
I went down for a very hurried little conference that didn't last over 15 minutes or 20 maybe. Monday afternoon of this week by Mr. Fred Bozart. And Of course, I know he was talking for the White House. He was talking for the president.
Stennis would listen to the tapes and verify the accuracy of written summaries prepared by Nixon and his lawyers. The prosecutors would have to settle for these summaries instead of the tapes.
Well, it was phony. It was phony as could be. Why pick Senator Stennis? First, he was a terrific senator for many years, but he was an old man, he couldn't hear, and he was going to listen to the tapes, and he was going to prepare a version. It was phony as it could be.
They had a picture of John Stennis in Time magazine with his hand to his ear and a caption which said, "Technical help needed." And I saw that, and I laughed so loudly that I almost fell on the floor, and as I looked up, I saw the pointy shoes of Richard Nixon looking down at me, and he did not see the humor in the situation.
I can only say that the fact that John Stennis had a problem with hearing does not mean that he could not, with the devices that are available to turn up the volume, have heard as well as anybody else.
Cox couldn't possibly agree to the plan. His list of objections focused on Stennis. He said that the task couldn't be entrusted to any one man. But the president wouldn't budge. He would not appeal to the Supreme Court, and he certainly would not turn over the tapes. Instead, on Friday morning, with the midnight deadline looming, he had Haig call Richardson back to the White House.
It was a strange meeting. I could only call it a rancid meeting.
The message to Richardson was that he was to ban Cox from issuing any more subpoenas to the president.
That, of course, put the situation in a very different light from what I had been willing to support.
The White House was counting on Cox to resign in protest when he received the ban. If he did not, then the president's survival hung on Richardson. Would he fire Cox for defying the president?
The question of what I would do in that event did not arise.
That was a crucial miscalculation, for Nixon's men thought they could rely on Richardson to do their bidding.
If Cox refused to abide by the transcripts and terminate requests for additional tapes, he would be fired.
There was agreement that Elliot Richardson was, in the language of that day and subsequent days, on board and was in agreement with the plan.
Haig reported to Nixon that Richardson might grumble, but they could count on him. The two men took a final stroll on the White House grounds before announcing, as though it were a concession, that the president would meet the court order by handing over the summaries verified by Senator Stennis.
Late. Indeed, I think I'd gone home. I got a call from Elliot Richardson saying, here's what's happened.
What happened was that the president had gone over Richardson's head and himself issued the order banning Cox from further attempts to obtain tapes, notes, or memoranda of presidential conversations. Without delay, the prosecutor turned the tables on the president.
So at that point, I turned around and came back in town to the offices in Washington and called Jim Doyle, who was very close to me, was a public relations advisor, pressman, and so forth.
This is Jim Doyle from Archibald Cox's office. I have a statement that I'm going to read as fast as you can take it. It's from Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox.
Newspaper deadlines were only 5 minutes away. I made a very short statement saying I intended to carry on with my job on the terms on which I'd accepted it.
In my judgment, the President is refusing to comply with the court decrees, period. I shall bring these points to the attention of the court and abide by its decision. Paragraph.
Cox scheduled a formal press conference for the next morning. The nation waited for the showdown between the president and the defiant prosecutor. Cox struck first, and the TV networks carried it live.
Good afternoon. This is the ballroom at the National Press Club in Washington, where Archibald Cox, the special Watergate prosecutor, is about to hold a press conference.
I read in one of the newspapers this morning the headline, Cox Defiant. I do want to say that I don't feel defiant. In fact, I told my wife this morning I hate a fight.
Indeed, to be honest, back home before we went to the press conference, I was in tears over having to do it.
But do it he did. Cox explained to the nation in a news conference why the law had to prevail.
Instruction: when criminal wrongdoing is the subject of investigation, it is simply not enough to make a compromise in which the real evidence is available only to 2 or 3 men operating in secrecy.
You consider the tapes absolutely vital to the case yourself?
I think it is vital to know.
Clarify or amplify, if possible, the 2 questions.
I have sort of a naive belief, if you'll forgive me for being corny, that what's right will prevail in the end.
I'll give you the document.
I frankly was stunned by how well he did, because Archie was not totally a public person. And this was, in the good sense, a superb political effort. It was absolutely convincing. It was human. It was almost endearing.
Any way whatsoever.
Well, then my question, sir, was how could you expect to succeed in this job? How could you expect to succeed?
Well, I thought it was worth a try. I thought it was important. If it could be done, I thought it would help the country. And if I lost, what the hell?
Mr. Cox, let me ask you about... Excuse me, Mr. Cox. The reporters over here are...
I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Yes.
By the time the news conference was finished, even the skeptical Washington press corps had been won over.
I don't know the answer to that.
Sir, you're a great American. You really are.
At the special prosecutor's show of defiance, Nixon decided to have him fired at once. For the Attorney General and his immediate subordinates, the moment of decision had come.
Richardson's secretary put her head in the door and said, "The Attorney General would like to see you." And I went in, and there was Ruckelshaus and Richardson and, 2 or 3 of Richardson's young aides. And it still hadn't crossed my mind what was going to happen.
It was clear that Cox was going to go. It was only a question of how, not whether. Elliott said, "I'm not going to do it." And I said, "Well, not me either. I decided that some time ago. I'm not interested in being part of this exercise."
And at that moment, for the first time, it occurred to me that I was the 3rd in line in the Department of Justice.
At that moment, Richardson said to Bork, "Well, Bob, what are you going to do? You're next."
I said, "Let me think." And I got up and I began pacing around the office while they talked about something else. And finally I said, "Yes, I can fire him, but I'll resign immediately afterwards."
Bork said that he had felt for some time that Cox was not conducting himself correctly, that he was not doing his job right, and indeed should be fired.
The president had to fire him. There was no alternative. Cox hadn't done anything wrong, but a president can't be faced down in public by a subordinate official.
Ruckelshaus and I said, "Well, in these circumstances, Bob, you will have to go ahead and fire him. You can't have a situation in which this goes all the way down to some Deputy Assistant Attorney General, with everybody above him having left. The business of the government has to go on."
The president was frantic to prevent a rash of resignations at the Justice Department. He stood by as White House counsel Len Garman phoned the Attorney General. But Richardson was firm. When named, he had undertaken as a condition of the Senate confirmation to protect Cox's independence, and he would not now break his word.
The president said, "I'm not surprised that
pious bastard cares more for his ass than his country.
And we were all very stricken by the moment. And Richardson left to present his resignation to the president.
The beginning of the conversation was really quite tense and difficult because he started talking about the Middle East. This was the President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief. And he went on to say, you realize that Brezhnev could make a very serious miscalculation in the light of what could happen if you go forward. I was considerably shaken, but I said, Mr. President, I don't feel that I have any choice. I cannot do it. And the President said, Elliot, I'm sorry you choose to put your purely personal commitments ahead of the public interest. And I could feel the blood rushing to my head, and I could have made a very angry response. But what I did say in as level of voice as I could muster, I said, Mr. President, it would appear that you and I have a different perception of the public interest.
No one yet knew it, but the Saturday night massacre had begun. Next on the list was Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus. Al Haig telephoned him with an ultimatum: fire Cox or resign.
Haig went into the crisis in the Middle East. He finally mentioned, didn't you realize this was an order from your commander-in-chief? This was after several minutes of conversation, and I said, come on, Al, what are you going to do, get a tank down here and blow me out of my office? I can't do this.
General reaction to the developments today? Well, there'll be an announcement out of the White House later on. I can't say if there will be. Does it have to do with the resignation of the Attorney General? Well, it might, but you'll have to get it from them. Excuse me. Thank you, Bill.
When Ruckelshaus went home, the press was still in the dark about how many potential attorneys general Nixon had gone through. The succession now passed to the number 3 man at the Justice Department.
So I got in Bork, the Solicitor General, a great constitutional lawyer.
Bob Bork was a different kind of fellow. He was a patriot, and I think a jurist of renowned dimensions, far better than either of his 2 superiors.
I went downstairs, and there were a White House driver, Bizarre in the back seat, Garment in the right front seat, the passenger seat.
And we plunked him down between, he sat between Bizarre and myself, so he couldn't bolt out of the door.
So I got him, we went over to the White House, to Haig's office. And Haig began explaining the international situation and how the president couldn't be faced down and so forth. And I said, I'm going to fire him. The only question is whether I resign immediately afterwards or not. He didn't look like he was interested too much in whether I resigned immediately afterwards or not, as long as I fired him. Haig took me to the Oval Office. And as I recall, the lights were kind of dim in there, and the place was very gloomy. They had not planned this kind of a massacre at all.
Nixon was finally rid of his troublesome prosecutor, but it would prove harder for the White House to get rid of Cox's office and fire his staff. The FBI agent who had worked the longest on the case was Angelo Lano. He got a call from his boss.
He said, Richardson's been fired, Cox has been fired, and you have to get over and take over the prosecutor's office. And I said, what?
Acting Attorney General Bork's second order that night caused almost as much uproar as the first. It seemed designed to protect prosecution documents from the prosecutors.
Haig told me that these documents were disappearing from the special prosecutor's office. Shouldn't we put the FBI around there? And I said yes.
Having done a hard night's work, Robert Bork went home.
The streets were pitch dark by this time, of course, and as I came out of the driveway of the Department of Justice, photographers from the press leapt out of the bushes. and I was quite surprised at this picture of me, looking like an axe murderer.
The outcry was just beginning.
The Office of the Watergate Special Prosecution Force has been abolished.
When the White House announced what it had done, the media reported it as a naked attempt by the president to overthrow the rule of law.
The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The president has fired the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox, and he has sent FBI agents to the office of the special prosecution staff and to the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, and the President has ordered the FBI to seal off those offices. That's a stunning development, and nothing even remotely like it has happened in all of our history.
We had no idea whether the Army was coming, the Marines. We had no idea whether our files would be taken away from us. We were told nothing.
Halfway through dinner, the phone rang. It was Hank Ruth. And he said, "Archie's been fired. Get to the office and save the evidence."
The young prosecutors got there before Angie Lano, the FBI man they'd always worked with.
So I went up, a couple of the assistant prosecutors were there, and they said, and started yelling at me.
Accused him of treachery, treason, working with the enemy, having been a pawn of the White House. We put it every which way we could.
So finally Henry Ruth shows up, and I figured, oh, my salvation. So Hank comes in, and I said, we go into the office, and I said, Hank, first of all, I don't want to be here, and I told him what had happened.
You know, I said, whose side are you on, Angie? Are you with us or are you against us? And he said, I'm just doing my job. And I said, well, where are your written orders, Angie?
You know, and I just said, take it out on somebody else. You know, I didn't want to come here. I don't want to be here, and I'm going to get out of here as quick as I can.
Excuse me, Foss.
Despite the FBI and the late hour, the special prosecutor's office was besieged by reporters.
Continuing the investigation?
Our press guy, Jimmy Doyle, came into my office finally and grabbed me and said, we're going upstairs. And I said, what for? And he said, the press is up there. You should have done this a long time ago. And marched me upstairs to a very small room where we had our library. And it seemed like the entire Washington press corps was in there. It was smoky, it was dark, it was really mayhem.
I must say, I suppose that human emotions take over in this kind of occasion, because one thinks that in a democracy maybe this would not happen, and that maybe we could proceed in good faith to prosecute those who have violated the criminal law. Apparently that is not to be the case, and we have been abolished.
The news bulletins went on late into the night.
The Tonight Show will not be seen tonight, so that we may bring you the following NBC News special report.
Mr. Cox's comment when he was told that he was apparently about to be fired was, whether ours shall continue to be a government of laws and not of men is now for Congress and ultimately the American people.
An investigator appointed to investigate scandals was fired because he insisted on investigating scandals.
The president may have an even more grave constitutional crisis on his hands.
In my career as a correspondent, I never thought I'd be announcing these things.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
An astonishing thing is happening here. He is getting an applause, not necessarily from the reporters, but from the Justice Department employees who are, as you see, lining the balcony. This is unusual.
Richardson's successor, on the other hand, didn't enjoy taking the blame for the president.
And I have asked all the personnel in the department to stay and help keep the department going in this extraordinarily difficult time. About the prosecutions.
Well, I did something I had never done before. I went into the press room.
Get in the back of the room now, and then we'll come
Did you order the FBI to take over the offices on Saturday night? And if so, why?
Guilty.
Amid this chaos, the White House failed to carry out its plan to dismiss Cox's staff. So, the rest of the prosecution staff sat tight.
The White House announced last night that you were abolished. Now, when did you begin to get word that you weren't abolished?
You know, the White House announced we were abolished, but if they announce the sky is green and then you look up and the sky is blue, now I presume that in the normal course of events that to abolish an agency takes some time. We are going to try like hell. We are a criminal prosecution force. We have reason to believe there's been some serious crime, and we want to prosecute it.
That's the White House.
It's very hard to describe how it feels to be fired by a president and disobey. All of a sudden, bundles of envelopes started to be dropped on our floor, and these were telegrams from the American people saying, hang in there, stay there, don't leave. And everybody was really caught up.
A record 150,000 telegrams condemning the president flooded Washington that weekend. Western Union had to call in extra workers and reprogram its computers to handle this firestorm of protest. Now Congress began to talk impeachment.
Most of the telegrams are short. They just say, impeach Richard Nixon or force him to resign.
Even though Cox was gone, Nixon still had to respond to the court order for the tapes. He had to recall his lawyer, who had already flown home to Texas.
I'm afraid that was over-optimistic after what happened yesterday.
The lawyers waited for instructions. Would the president bow to the wave of protests or remain defiant? He had until the court hearing on Tuesday.
We had no idea what Charles Allen Wright was going to say. No idea at all. I thought we were headed towards some kind of need to bring a contempt action against the president. There were no speeches, there was no preamble. Charles Allen Wright just got up and said,
There would have been those who would have said that the president is defying the law. This president does not defy the law.
At which some of us almost broke out laughing, given the events of 3 days previous. And then he said the president would turn over the tapes that had been requested. Extraordinary.
I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next...
When Richard Nixon yielded and agreed to hand over the tapes, he knew they could destroy him. Soon, everyone would know.